Hello, colleagues at Lumen. Uh, my, we are going to present today myself, Professor Eric Gilder from Papua New Guinea University of Technology, and Sever Avram, Executive President at EUROLINK. We're presenting on new times, new knowledge, and finding the NorthStar of success in a changing world of learning. At the close of my RSA CVP presentation in 2020, I had noted, as the psychologist Abraham Maslow studies of the most successful people demonstrated, once the stage of self-actualization is properly completed, then and perhaps only then can one then approach the true generativity of human action, perhaps discovering a way out of what Harold Bloom had called the anxiety of interpretation, relieved only by embracing the inevitable misprising of language in our bodies, in his view. Logos should I would argue, it should stand for truth, however imperfectly perceived through our senses and passions, if nothing else. The question that I and my colleague wish to explore here today is whether even the very successful people which Maslow has sampled in his work can survive and prosper in the new AI-driven world that is increasingly at our doorstep. Question: can craft work survive in an AI world? As I had mentioned back in 2020, craft labor intellectual workers could work from home in the COVID-19 pandemic, whilst essential organic labor workers had no choice but to risk their body's health in the client-facing jobs on which we all depended. Now, both categories of workers will be objects and subject of a new transformed workspace. First, we need to consider an ancient distinction of knowledge seen again. As a primordial concept of human experience, knowledge in a broad sense was not necessarily and always linked to explicit learning, but rather something bestowed from on high or mysteriously granted. As knowledge became seen as necessary for human social advancement, it became at first a tacit knowledge represented more in the prerogative of narrow elites and connected with certain social attributes related to mystery, initiation, fostering demonic and traumatic states, with potentially negative consequences or unfortunate bargains being made, as it was in the development of new weapons from Leonardo da Vinci onwards. The coming of the technique with the Industrial Revolution. Along with the coming of the Industrial Revolution, social massification in the sense of Marcuse, the exacerbation of consumerism and literacy campaigns, or other large-scale social experiments, knowledge became increasingly involved in a process of so-called democratization and adaptation to trends that increasingly relate to economic and at most social competitiveness. So, in a word, for the need of a provisional, planned, programmatic, and generally pragmatically oriented learning. In the triumph of the technological age, technique was manifested especially at the level of those who guided and implemented learning criteria in various systems, stages of conceptual and societal evolution, which elaborate increasingly diversified and complex methodologies in various curricular areas or systems of approach to knowledge and learning. A long polemic was manifested in this sense, especially in the United States, where we are able to remember the purpose of supporting and encouraging the development of elite sciences and knowledge in the abstract fields without an embodied connection with the social applicability to practical learning for the living for the masses and their consecutive implementation capacities. From the point of view of political and administrative decision makers in these societies, the emphasis had largely been shifted toward utilitarianism and scientism where it concerns knowledge. Therefore, strong emphasis was placed on the training of generic technical skills. Only later in more advanced societies, this orientation shifted to soft skills, especially to the training and consolidation of those related to social and emotional intelligence, critical thinking, educating active global citizens, especially on topics related to sustainable development and combating climate change. Officially, it's foreseen by the UN, rather ambitiously, for 2030. A Gnostic rebellion against the mere mass technique was underway. The economic euphoria of the 1960s and 1970s was quite naive, not being based on geoeconomic realities that were only taken into account later, that is, regarding the impact on the environment, that had been marked by an obsession with increasingly the classically calculated gross domestic product at any cost. By focusing upon industrial competition only, policymakers had few ways of respecting the age-old pact between the human being and nature, which at that stage had only led to relatively marginal pro-ecological or New Age reactions. However, the transformation of nature into a means of production was constantly accompanied by important components of social alienation and ever more intense forms of social and individual anxiety. Even diversified forms of deception, even depression, not only in Europe but in the United States. Even if it was not necessarily possible to empirically demonstrate a direct link between these processes at the home life level, encompassing both psychosocial health, both individually and collectively, it is obvious that these negative, toxic consequences are interconnected, producing ill effects at a territorial level of local and regional development, demography, and so forth. But there is hope of transforming the technocratic age into a humane one. Returning to the role intended for learning and implicitly to access the knowledge through this transformation, we propose to address here the particular rigor, the question of how and for whom learning serves, especially considering the broader meaning of it throughout life, since we are seeing frequently antagonistic models of the so-called great project of human development with humans as key objects or subjects. It is clear that we are no longer even in the somewhat idyllic stage of Adorno and Horkheimer, which the desire to achieve some changes in the modern to the post-Renaissance neo-humanism and its successors were still felt. Although fictional literature often still talks about dangerous dystopias, about the symbolic imprisonment of us in a kind of desert of the Tartars, about a new Kafkian penitentiary colony, or according to Michelangelo and Antonioni, a red desert, we wonder if people still take it all seriously. As we move from a humane analog technology to a robotic digital one, we're dealing with the triggering of the dominance of digitalization AI applications with the misleading information styles and traditional ways of approaching knowledge. The dissemination of knowledge has predominantly taken on extremely pragmatic and entrepreneurial characteristics. Indeed, there have been these have been accepted and appropriated by the majority of societies as inevitable driving forces. In parallel, as a kind of psychological thumbback, entire societies and social groups have chosen hyper-hedonism or hyper-repression practice in various ways as alternative compensatory but not remedial attitudes. In relation to the responses, pressure is strongly related to the new wars of bellicose threats, pandemics, calamities, etc., go on and on. More recently, in face of these challenges, universities themselves have embraced this pro-entrepreneurial and technologically innovative wave, continuously innovating almost as a goal in itself, as a pursuit of perhaps elusive competitive advantage through their educational offer. Yet we cannot claim that we don't see eternal trends of profound social injustice, of modern slavery, of emphasis on the exploitation of naivete and good faith through enormous political media manipulations, etc. For example, the high promises of the Sustainable Development Goals have yet to be met. Therefore, we have an open social, political, and inflection points here in the AI epoch. So a wide-ranging spread of solutions is already being configured for the concerns noted here. The question is, in what sense will the learning of the future evolve to face challenges? Could it be more or less traditionalist or instrumental ex cathedra type or something else? To which type of beneficiaries will the learning and knowledge predominantly benefit? To the advocated transhumanism articulated by Elon Musk, for example, or on the contrary, a high humanism bound by the rigors of a new intellectual revolution, as articulated by the European Commission. Where does a humane, sustainable development, a broad meaning, including post-pandemic resilience, flexible pragmatism, and opening to interdisciplinarity and ethical options such as self-responsibility, social responsibility, in the sense of Edgar Morin's reflection on a post-proactive European citizenship fit in? What of the democratic liberal values dedicated to opposing fanatical radicalization tendencies in Europe, of combating democratically elected autocracies with their counterfactual attempts of arbitrary rewriting of post-factual history. Now we have a struggle at our hands, geopolitical powers. According to Ian Bremmer and Cliff Kupachan, we are at a critical inflection point at the crossroads of what they call a technopolar world, defined by a shift in power from state governmental actors, responsible at least in part to their national publics, towards ungrounded technopros of immense wealth of uncertain political loyalties. It is upon this cloud stage that the geopolitical struggles are now underway between the traditional post-World War II Western keepers of the world governing order and an insurgent China-Russia global South power bloc, who seek to redesign a refashioned world order according to a relativistic multilateralism, often in opposition to a US, EU, UN universalist hegemony. Polarization. Following the outbreak of war in the Ukraine and Black Sea area, the polarization between autocratic regimes and liberal democratic societies have considerably increased. Also, the illiberal democracy model has become more and more seductive for various geopolitical regions, especially here in Central and Eastern Europe, under the challenge posed by Viktor Orban of Hungary. Such a changing and challenging controversial landscape, paradoxically, however, has become an opportunity, mostly for the EU and NATO, to revise security-related legislation, such as the functionality of AI systems, the allocation of responsibility between different economic operations, changes the concept of safety, and so on. After some delay at the EU level, the elaboration of the new regulatory framework for AI has taken place. Such a new framework focuses on most of the critical issues, such as the use of others' data to train AI, for example, and the newly applicable legal requirements are to be compiled in practice and be effectively enforced in view of protecting both citizens and entire societies. The moves toward effective and ethical security governance in the EU. In terms of governance, the EU security structures to be assumed also by each member state should guarantee maximum stakeholder participation, including researchers and civil society organizations. In terms of power ideological constructions, one of the main dangers would relate to the rationalized kind of unaccountability by entire organizations or societies. The main ethical concern is considered to be concentrated on the risk of new political dimension of intelligent agents and algorithms. The coming AI and ChatGPT revolution, changing education for all models, elites and mass populations. As a matter of example, the appearance of ChatGPT from the beginning seemed to herald an era of mass accessibility of more and more learners as a so-called amalgamated collected knowledge. Most of the initial academic intellectual reactions have been manifested at the level of a fear of more subtle plagiarisms or mere compilations of disinformation. However, a much deeper concern, an idiomatic issue, relates to the loss of encouraging the self-exploration attempt by knowing human subjects of holding to original thoughts and interpretation possibilities. Thus, the entire transformation of education promoted and stimulated by UNESCO and the EU, as known as lifelong learning, should now be explicitly much more attached to holistic mindful learning as a final goal. As a consequence, we should further more clearly target ways to identify individual and social stakes of humane knowledge. This should concern not only the current stage of overlapping crises and the conceptual deadlock in which we tend to be stuck, but also for equipping students today to meet tomorrow's challenges. As a conclusion, it means the entire educational world should move towards courageous transposition of this lifelong learning vision through a holistic and integrative exploration of what it means to embrace a new intellectual renaissance. Different crises, turning points, same educative prescription. Back in the first weeks of September 2001, actually dates 5 through 9, author Gilder took part in a World Future Studies Federation meeting in Brasov, Many cultures, one world, globalization, local development. It was a wonderful meeting, and the futurists there, by and large, painted a largely bright future of the world with some existential caveats. Gilder penned a somewhat cheeky contribution on naming the beast properly, pointing out the limits and contradictions of a lofty New World Order envisioned by the senior H.W. Bush presidency. I had stated, even if we debate the precise meaning of globalization, it is not in doubt that the world is a more pluralistic and complex place. Therefore, I posit that facing the challenges of the 21st century require not mere intercultural communication ability on the part of individuals, but rather intercultural empathy, not mindless galloping consumption practices, but engaged extensive earth-here-ness, not hankering after security and avoidance of scarcity, but embracing the Aristotelian values of sustainability, of having and being enough. We need to remember here that Adam Smith and Karl Marx were, in the main, moral and not economic philosophers. What they sought was knowledge of how people and societies best flourish. Let us look here. In my work in higher educational policy developments over 3 continents, I am currently exploring along this path of thought, and I have continued doing so. So thank you for your attention.